So here's what actually happened. King Charles quietly stripped Camilla of her real influence, not the tiara she wears at banquets, but the working authority that sits behind it, and slid all of it across the table to Catherine, Princess of Wales. And when you look at how the whole thing was engineered, it feels less like a family squabble and more like a boardroom takeover written months in advance. What really lands like a slap is that Camilla, according to insiders, made one last desperate push to nail her position down in writing. The palace didn't even entertain it. No summit, no negotiation, no polite back and forth. It was shut down like the request itself was beneath discussion. That isn't a husband and wife disagreeing over breakfast. That is the institution making a ruling. And once you rewind the tape, the entire situation stops looking like a sudden ambush and starts resembling a strategy that has been slowly ticking along for years, while the public was busy watching louder scandals unfold somewhere else. Before we dig in, if you're new around here at Royal Decode, tap that subscribe button so the next investigation lands right in your feed. Now let's rewind to the chapter of this saga that everyone seems to have collectively deleted from memory. To understand why the corridors of the palace are reportedly buzzing with panic today, you have to go back and read the small print signed in 2005. Camilla was never meant to become queen. This isn't tinfoil hat territory or something whispered on some obscure forum. It was the literal bargain struck out in the open just to stop the crowds from jeering when she and Charles walked through that rather grim civil ceremony. The same ceremony Charles's own mother didn't even show her face at. The palace's official line was crystal clear back then. She would carry the title Princess Consort, not Queen. Queen Elizabeth later released a statement stating she wished for Camilla, then Duchess of Cornwall, to eventually be known as Queen Consort. But the deal presented to the British public at the start was Princess Consort, and that tiny word swap carried enormous weight. The royals weren't being modest when they made that pledge. They were flat out scared of the public, because Diana's memory still pulled higher than Charles and Camilla put together, and shoving a Queen Camilla down the nation's throat so soon after Diana's death would have detonated on live television. That promise, like most vows sworn behind palace curtains when the mood outside turns ugly, had a shelf life shorter than a supermarket sandwich. The moment ambition needed room to breathe, the whole arrangement quietly vanished. When Queen Elizabeth passed away in 2022, Charles climbed onto the throne and pulled Camilla up alongside him as Queen Consort without so much as a pause. That old Princess Consort promise? Balled up and tossed away like a receipt from a dinner nobody wants to admit they ordered. The palace pretended this had always been the roadmap, as though the entire country had somehow misread the memo. Everyone else recognized it for what it plainly was, a switcheroo executed in broad daylight. After decades of wearing the villain's cape in the Diana story, after being cast as public enemy #1 on nearly every tabloid front page, Camilla walked away with the crown regardless. It turns out that if you simply outlast the outrage, the monarchy will happily bend its own bylaws just to keep the family portrait looking tidy. But the crown sitting on her head didn't come with solid ground beneath her feet. Sources inside the palace insist that from her very first day as queen, Camilla was quietly locked out of the rooms where a queen ought to have a chair. Her office, they claim, was kept in the dark about succession blueprints and long-range strategy for the institution's future. Whenever conversations arose about which charities got royal endorsement, whose face would front the family's brand, or which direction the messaging machine would take, her desk was reportedly skipped over entirely. She got the sparkling title, the priceless jewels, and the reserved seat at every state banquet. But the actual levers of power sat behind a locked drawer she was never handed the key to. The takeaway seemed to be that the family had zero objection to her modeling the diamonds, as long as she didn't try to grab the wheel. The friendship between Camilla and Catherine, meanwhile, was always packaged for the cameras as this warm mentor and protege bond. In practice, according to those who saw them up close, it was little more than a chilly professional arrangement. These two women were operating in completely different universes. They observed the courtesies expected of them whenever they shared a room, because polite composure is basically the job description for a British royal. But nobody was texting each other jokes or meeting up for a coffee run to trade palace gossip. Anyone paying attention could see that the visible warmth had the same authenticity as a reality show cast pretending they've been best friends since childhood. It looked like two rival ambassadors shaking hands for the flashbulbs, And the instant the lenses turned away, the pleasantries evaporated, and both women retreated back into their own separate lanes. Yet behind the scenes, small tectonic movements were already underway, quiet but consequential. If their bond was never genuinely warm to begin with, wasn't a power realignment always just a matter of time? While the entire planet was glued to Harry and Meghan's rolling Netflix saga and their book tour circuit, a far weightier maneuver was unfolding out of frame. Catherine wasn't merely turning up to cut ribbons and beam politely for the paparazzi. She was steadily accumulating credibility and clout at a level that blindsided almost everyone watching. This wasn't about styling a good outfit or nailing the perfect hair for a walkabout. Insiders describe it as a cool, deliberate campaign to establish herself as the one indispensable figure in the building. She was quietly running the long game while the rest of the family was tangled up in feuds over podcast episodes and who allegedly said what in an interview from 3 years back. There's honestly something impressive about watching someone convert what most people treat as a handshaking hobby into a strategic power shift, all while the rest of the household was busy live streaming its dirty laundry to the entire globe. Her early childhood initiative was never just another royal vanity project where a name gets slapped on a foundation and you drop in once a year for a group photo. While most of her in-laws were content to stand around looking regal, Catherine was pulling neuroscientists and government ministers into rooms to actually talk about brain development and early years policy. That's the kind of substantive policy engagement no royal had genuinely attempted in decades. It bought her a seat at conference tables where a princess sash alone doesn't usually earn you the microphone. She started speaking in the language of data and long-term social outcomes rather than smiling for the standard charity portrait beside a commemorative plaque. Reports suggest she was genuinely closing loops, executing on projects, and even the king couldn't dodge the reality that she was becoming the sharpest operator in the whole palace ecosystem. Then came the health earthquake, and it flipped the entire royal script upside down. Early in 2024, the announcement landed that Catherine had cancer following abdominal surgery. She addressed it herself, saying she'd undergone major abdominal surgery in London, that at the time the condition was thought to be non-cancerous, but that later testing revealed something more serious. It hit the institution like a detonation. This wasn't the usual polite murmur of national sympathy followed by a quick news cycle turnover. The public response was enormous, and more importantly, it felt real, not stage-managed. For countless viewers, it was the first genuine emotional pulse they'd felt toward a royal since Diana's death. We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed. That kind of raw public emotion is rare currency. People were weeping without cue, stacking bouquets outside Kensington Palace without any press office nudging them into it. It wasn't a photo op or a carefully rehearsed media beat. It happened because the affection was already there, which is astonishing for a family that often carries the emotional temperature of a wax museum. The way Catherine navigated her illness reportedly boosted her stock, not just among the public, but within the palace's own inner corridors. She didn't unravel. She released that composed video, took her time returning to duty, and shielded her children from the worst of the storm while enduring an ordeal that would flatten most people. By late 2024, People magazine reported that her conduct pushed King Charles, who was managing his own cancer battle in parallel, to genuinely reflect on the road ahead. He was said to be asking himself who truly holds public trust and who has the spine to hold the institution steady when the sky falls in. Turns out, nothing accelerates a promotion quite like keeping your composure while your entire life detonates in front of billions. The dominant question echoing through the palace corridors became simple. Who actually has the nerve and the credibility to shoulder the crown through the next crisis? Insiders say the answer was becoming almost embarrassingly clear. Catherine's stock was rising, and Camilla, they claim, felt the shift the way you sense the pressure drop before a thunderstorm rolls in. There wasn't one specific explosive confrontation or defining argument. It was just an atmospheric change. All at once, advisors stopped queuing at her door, and the meaningful questions were being routed to another office entirely. And while Camilla dug in her heels, the institution around her was already tilting in a new direction. By spring 2025, the whispers had hardened into headlines about a full-blown internal restructuring. Major publications were reporting that King Charles had formally begun transferring the substantial workload from Camilla's portfolio into Catherine's. We're not talking about a couple of extra school visits or reshuffled lunch dates in the diary. This was a calculated stripping of institutional authority from Camilla and a handover to the daughter-in-law who had suddenly become the most beloved figure in the family. The pundits who make their living decoding royal moves were genuinely rattled, because this didn't read like a temporary bridge while Camilla stepped back for a breather. It read like a permanent step down. The king was rearranging the seating chart, and Camilla's chair kept getting scooted further from the head of the table. The real dagger in the whole reorganization was how the patronages were parceled out. In the royal universe, patronages aren't decorative side gigs or filler for a Wikipedia page. They're the only thing giving these figures a purpose beyond waving from balconies. Holding a major patronage is essentially owning equity in the family firm. Several of the most prestigious ones, spanning the arts, literature, and hospitals, were reportedly pried loose from Camilla and passed to Catherine. These were causes Camilla had cultivated for decades, showing up for, championing, attaching her name to. Losing them wasn't a calendar tweak. It was the wholesale erasure of a lifetime of work. The palace essentially wiped her professional identity and handed the login credentials to Catherine, without so much as a farewell card. Beyond the patronages themselves, sources point to a second, arguably heavier shift in the flow of access. Where previously Catherine's contact with the king's senior advisory circles had been routed carefully through formal channels, which is standard protocol for a Princess of Wales whose husband hasn't yet ascended, she was reportedly now being pulled into conversations that had once been the private preserve of Charles and Camilla alone. The advisory ring surrounding the king was, allegedly, expanding in only one direction, toward Catherine, and by natural extension, toward William. The meaning of this shift was something any veteran palace watcher could read blindfolded. The king was reportedly repositioning his daughter-in-law not as a distant future asset, but as an active present one who needed to be in the room today. None of this, obviously, has been formally acknowledged by Buckingham Palace. Royal communications don't work through disclosure. The palace doesn't hold press briefings announcing internal power transfers. There are no earnings calls explaining the redistribution of patronages. It speaks through the muted grammar of institutional behavior, through what happens rather than what is announced. And what was reportedly happening, the accumulating pattern, was telling a story that seasoned royal correspondents, fluent in that grammar, were finding harder and harder to write off as coincidence. According to insiders, Camilla was watching every piece of this unfold, and she wasn't just sipping tea and letting it slide. Beneath that carefully cultivated, dignified exterior, the one she had painstakingly built after decades of enduring public loathing, something was simmering. A response was on the way, and when it finally surfaced, it would reportedly amount to the most consequential decision she'd made since her wedding day at Windsor. This is the moment the mask genuinely cracked. According to Angela Levin, a journalist who has spent years reporting on the king and has deep contacts inside the palace, Camilla finally reached her limit and demanded a written guarantee. She wasn't after a nice sentiment on a birthday card or a reassuring nod at dinner. She reportedly wanted it committed to paper that her rank, her remaining responsibilities, and her standing wouldn't be touched. She wanted a shield against Catherine's rise and whatever future turbulence public opinion might throw at her. It was essentially the royal equivalent of a prenup, delivered right in the middle of a family already fraying under health crises and unrelenting public dissection. Insiders described it as an ultimatum in polite packaging, which is really just a genteel way of saying she pressed a blade to the king's throat and labeled it a formal request. Camilla, in effect, wanted a signed document confirming she still mattered. She wasn't satisfied with the handshake. She wanted it enshrined in the rulebook, formalized and untouchable. When she asked, the answer came back as a flat no. It wasn't a shouting match down some hallway with staff pretending they hadn't heard. It was simply a cold, professional dismissal. The king's team is said to have told her, in effect, that the monarchy has to remain flexible, which is corporate speak for, we need to follow whoever the public actually likes, and right now, that isn't you. They argued that a written commitment would restrict them when public sentiment shifted, when the next generation needed to step forward, when the institution had to reinvent itself to survive. They even had the audacity to frame the rejection as being for her own protection, which is the ultimate boardroom trick, torching someone's ego while insisting it's for the good of the company. The plain translation of that fancy rejection was straightforward. No. The palace basically told her she could keep the ceremonial title and her spot in the procession, but the real power was permanently off the menu. They refused to formalize her authority over the charities and inner circles because a signed contract makes it far too difficult to reverse course later. They needed the freedom to reclaim that authority the moment it suited them, and paperwork is just an annoying speed bump for a proper corporate reshuffle. People close to Camilla say she was utterly furious, but she didn't stage a scene. She channeled the kind of quiet, glacial rage you only develop after being labeled the most hated woman in the country for 30 years and surviving it. There were no public breakdowns or convenient tabloid leaks designed to embarrass the king. Instead, she simply went silent. And anyone who's been near the palace lately reports that the silence is deafening, pointed, and arctic. But even as Camilla settled into that frozen quiet, the king was already sketching a future that didn't seem to include her fully. If his blueprint was so clearly built around William and Catherine, where exactly did that leave Camilla in the long game? Since taking the throne, Charles has been vocal, almost obsessive, about his dream of a slimmed-down monarchy. He wants a leaner payroll, sharper accountability, and a compact team that actually produces measurable results for once. This wasn't just a soundbite dropped into a speech or a modernization talking point for a magazine profile. It was a formal policy pivot, and it has already started to redraw the internal balance of power in ways impossible to ignore. It's becoming increasingly obvious who remains at the center of the frame and who is being gently, courteously nudged toward the door. In Charles's mental map, the monarchy's future isn't a duo of him and Camilla. It's the figures who can keep the institution's lights burning for another century. And that means the spotlight has swung entirely toward William and Catherine. They're the only ones carrying the public's trust and possessing the survival instincts to navigate the modern world without constantly tripping over their own headlines. By the king's own logic, they hit the sweet spot, mature enough to command gravity, young enough to feel relevant, and popular enough that people actually want to see their faces on the currency. According to major reports from The Guardian and The Times, Charles isn't just being a cheerleader on the sidelines with an encouraging thumbs up. He's reportedly functioning as Catherine's personal career strategist. He's said to be reviewing her major speeches before delivery, cracking open doors for her that ordinarily take years of seniority to unlock, and using her recovery from cancer as an emotional touchstone the monarchy desperately needed to bank. He's treating her the way a CEO would treat a hand-picked heir apparent, betting the store on the single individual he believes can actually rescue the enterprise once he's gone. Camilla, sources indicate, doesn't slot as neatly into this forward-facing vision. She has genuinely earned respect in certain circles, no question. She has demonstrated a resilience few could have summoned after decades of being savaged in print. Against long odds, she has managed to convert a hostile public narrative into something resembling reluctant tolerance. But her age, her history, and the tangled, unresolved baggage she still carries from the Diana era mean that, in Charles's long-term arithmetic, she reportedly represents the monarchy's present rather than its future. A dignified, accomplished present, certainly, but present all the same, not future. Charles has apparently decided the monarchy's tomorrow belongs to Catherine and the generation standing behind her. And that verdict has parked Camilla in a painful holding pattern, watching her influence drain away with almost no lever available to stop it. Beyond the modern politics and strategic maneuvering, there is a far older, far more intimate force at play here, one rooted in memory rather than policy. It feels like a ghost that never truly departed the palace is now dictating the terms of what comes next, and that ghost is Diana. There is a bruising historical irony that after decades of trying to move on, the king is reportedly constructing his new era around a woman who reminds the public of the very person the institution once worked so relentlessly to manage and then to erase. No honest telling of this story can sidestep the presence that has haunted every room since August 1997. Princess Diana has been gone almost 3 decades now, absent for longer than many of her current mourners have been alive. And yet, her hold on how the public reads Camilla remains as fierce as any formal royal decree. Inside the monarchy, Diana isn't just a memory. She is a load-bearing structural element that still dictates where the walls of the institution can and cannot stand. There is something almost cosmically ironic about the fact that the one person the palace tried hardest to move past is the one who still decides where everyone else is permitted to place their feet. When Catherine's cancer news broke in early 2024, the public reaction went into total meltdown. Commentators started comparing it to the emotional chaos that followed Diana's death, which is uncomfortable, but also uncomfortably accurate. Princess Diana has died following a car crash in Paris. That was the moment the world stopped spinning. This wasn't manufactured grief cooked up in some crisis PR office. It was the real thing. People felt a genuine bond with Diana because she'd spent years simply showing up and behaving like an actual human being trapped inside the royal fishbowl. She didn't seem to be performing, which is probably why everyone felt like they personally knew her. Now the world was collectively unraveling because one of the few genuinely likable royals, Catherine, might actually be mortal after all. And that realization rushed all the old feelings straight back to the surface. Camilla can inherit every charitable role and formal title the family has to offer, but it won't touch the deeper problem. She can attend every dreary state dinner, hit every scripted line on cue, and stand precisely where the photographers point her. It doesn't shift the needle. The public's feelings toward her remain a formal, mildly forced politeness because she's been on the scene forever and hasn't detonated a fresh scandal recently. That's nothing like the near-devotional attachment people have to Catherine. No amount of premium PR or clever image rebranding can manufacture genuine affection. It's baked into the cultural bedrock at this point, and every person inside the palace knows it. The whisper is that even Charles knows the score and is making his moves on the cold understanding that the public just doesn't feel it for his wife. Tina Brown wrote an entire book on how the royals remain haunted by the 1990s, and she wasn't wrong. Every move they make now is essentially a reaction to the wreckage they left behind with Diana. They failed her. Everyone knows they did, and the public has an infinite memory for that kind of thing. Then Catherine enters the frame, young, apparently sincere, prioritizing her children over the family firm. Facing cancer with quiet composure only cemented that affection further. Princess Kate's shocking cancer announcement on Friday. That video she released was direct, vulnerable, and nothing like the standard palace communication template. She isn't trying to be Diana version 2, but she gives off the same emotional resonance that made people care in the first place. It's an echo the palace can't muffle, no matter how firmly it tries to sail past the past. Diana's ghost is still stalking those corridors, and it is actually becoming more relevant with each passing year, not less. This isn't because anyone in the family is actively sabotaging Camilla. It's because the public simply never moved on. People have been holding on to very specific expectations and emotional needs for decades. They were merely waiting for someone they actually liked to fill the vacuum. Now that Catherine has walked into it, Camilla is trapped in a shadow she can never outrun, no matter how many ribbons she cuts. So what's the takeaway from all this? Camilla spent half a lifetime clawing her way toward acceptance from a family that despised her, only to finally seize the crown and discover it was being diluted anyway. Then you have Catherine, who never signed up for any of this drama in the first place. She's simply trying to recover her health, raise her children, and do her duties without being dragged into a succession fight she never wanted. Meanwhile, Charles is supposedly the puppeteer rewriting the rules from behind the curtain, all while wrestling with his own significant health battles that would sideline most men his age entirely. It's a tangled disaster. The monarchy has managed to endure for centuries by projecting stability while quietly shape-shifting in the background. But this round, the gears are grinding audibly enough for outsiders to hear. Historians love to point out that this exact type of drama has replayed itself again and again through the ages. The British royals are practically masters at hollowing out someone's authority while allowing them to keep the glittering title. Throughout history, plenty of queens and consorts have discovered painfully that wearing a crown doesn't guarantee you run a single thing. The palace has the choreography down to a science, knowing exactly how to render a role ceremonially meaningless without ever making the demotion visible to the public. In Camilla's case, she isn't being tossed out or publicly humiliated. She's simply being managed, gently and quietly, until her role becomes decorative and nothing more. It's a cold, calculated procedure that the monarchy has refined over centuries to keep the machinery humming without noise. This isn't just another dull royal reshuffle or a hollow PR performance. It's a flashing neon arrow pointing to exactly where this entire institution is heading. Charles is effectively wagering the future of the crown on Catherine. He's transferring real influence into her hands and positioning her as the protagonist of the next chapter, because he understands she's the only one the public genuinely responds to in an emotional way. And since the spotlight only holds room for one leading figure at a time, Camilla is being nudged into the wings, courteously but firmly. He's trading the wife for the daughter-in-law, because when everything is stripped down, the brand needs a face that people don't instinctively scroll past when a headline pops up. For the monarchy, this pivot is enormous, and honestly, probably overdue. At the end of the day, the royals exist only because the public tolerates them, and every poll confirms that the public trusts William and Catherine far more than the rest of the clan combined. Charles is simply reading the math. He knows that if the crown is going to endure in the modern era, he has to lean fully into the figures the public actually adores. This isn't about him being sentimental or playing favorites among relatives. It's brutal strategy. He's willing to move his own wife into the shadows to preserve the family business, which is exactly the sort of ruthless calculation kings have been making for centuries whenever the survival of the institution is on the line. But the one thing the palace spin machine can't gloss over is that on a purely human level, this is genuinely cruel. Camilla isn't just a chess piece to be shifted around whenever the ratings dip. She spent decades cast as the most hated woman in Britain, blamed for wrecking a marriage that was already smoldering long before she ever entered the picture. She endured years of being ripped apart in the tabloids, branded with every insult imaginable, and she kept quietly showing up until she finally earned a sliver of grudging acceptance. She did the work, put in the hours, filled the role, and now all of that effort is being pushed aside because the people upstairs decided the brand photographs better with a fresher face front and center. They're essentially rewriting her job description behind her back because a more marketable cover model appeared. After 3 decades of being cast as the villain in the national imagination, she finally lifts the crown, only to be told she's being renegotiated for an upgraded model. That is a uniquely bitter flavor of corporate hell, and the fact that it's playing out inside a family only sharpens the sting. The institution always survives, but the people inside it don't always get to keep what they were promised. And Camilla, it appears, has just learned that lesson the hard way.